Dear students, today I am going to explain you one of the most interesting story in your ICSE syllabus, A Face in the Dark. It's written by Ruskin Bond. So this story tells us about the experience of a teacher, a one-day experience of a teacher that fills the reader with thrill and horror. So let's get started. Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher, was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station of Simla. So in the very beginning of the story, we are introduced to the main character of the story, that is Mr. Oliver. He is an Anglo-Indian. That means one of his parent is Indian and other is a Britisher. And he's a teacher. He's a teacher at a school that is situated on the outskirts of hill station of Simla. So, right, we are also told about the setting of the story. The story is set in Simla. From before Kipling's time, Kipling is another author, Rudyard Kipling, who has written the famous Jungle Book. And before the time he was born, from before Kipling's time means before Kipling was born, the school had been run on English public school lines. So the school followed the rules and regulations that were followed by British schools then. So we are talking about a time when there were no proper schools. There were no proper equipments or no proper resources to teach students. During those times, this school was run on English public school line. The standards of the school were similar to the standards of schools that were run by Britishers. So this was a very renowned and reputed school. And boys, most of them from wealthy Indian families. And it was a boys' school. And the boys who studied in the school belonged to wealthy Indian families, wore blazers, caps and ties. So they had proper uniform to wear. They wore blazers, caps and ties during the time when there were no, students didn't have proper clothes to wear. So this school had a proper set uniform for the students to wear. Life magazine, that is also one of the famous magazine, in a feature on India had once called it Eton of East. Eton is a very reputed and renowned school of England. So this school where Mr. Oliver is teaching is being compared to Eton School of England. So that is because of the standard of the school where Mr. Oliver is teaching. Because why is it compared to Eton of East? Because the school is being run on English public school lines. And the boys were from wealthy families. The boys who studied in the school were from wealthy Indian families and they wore blazers, caps and ties. So that is why Life magazine once featured on India and called this school where Mr. Oliver taught, compared this school to the Eton School of England. Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. The Simla Bazaar with its cinemas and restaurants was about 3 miles from the school. So the Simla Bazaar was situated 3 miles away from the school and it was famous for its cinemas and restaurants. And Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, usually strolled. Strolled means walked in a relaxed manner into the town in the evening, returning after the dark, when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. And Mr. Oliver, it was his usual routine that he walked to the bazaar, Simla Bazaar, in the evening and returned back to his school after it got dark. And he always took a shortcut through the pine forest. So this was his usual routine. So what was the usual routine of Mr. Oliver? The usual routine of Mr. Oliver was that every evening he walked to the Simla Bazaar and returned from there after dark and took a shortcut through the pine forest. When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made airy sounds that kept most of the people to the main road. So now we'll be reading about the experience of Mr. Oliver, one day experience of Mr. Oliver, that what did he experience on that day. So strong winds were blowing and the pine trees were making sad airy sound. Airy is very strange and frightening sound. And because of this disturbing and frightening atmosphere, most of the people, they traveled through the main road, though it was a longer passage, longer way. But they didn't prefer to travel through pine forest because of the strange atmosphere and frightening and horrifying atmosphere in the pine forest. But Mr. Oliver always took the shortcut from pine forest, despite the frightening and airy sounds. So now we have come across that the pine trees, the tall pine trees, made a very awfully sad and whistling sound when the winds passed through them. And in the story, the nature of the sound seems to be very disturbing, and that is why the passerbys, they avoid traveling through the pine forest. So that is the reason that the passerby did not travel to the pine forest. So if you get a question that why most of the people did not prefer to travel through the main road, because they were frightened by the sad and airy sound of the pine trees in the pine forest. But Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or imaginative man. So this line is very ironical in sense that what would happen next is totally in contrast to what is being told here. It is said that he was not nervous or imaginative man. That is why he took a shortcut from the pine forest and did not travel through the main road, because he was not afraid of anything and he did not imagine anything extraordinary. But what happened next is totally in contrast to what is being said here. He carried a torch and it gleams, the batteries were running down. So Mr. Oliver, he always carried a torch with him, so that because he always returned after dark from the Simla Bazaar. So he carried a torch with him so that he could safely reach back his school. And on the same day, when about which we'll be reading now, about which we are reading in the story, on the same very day, he carried a torch. He then also carried a torch, but the batteries of the torch were running out and the light was flickering, turning off and on. Moved fitfully means for a short period, down the narrow forest path, when its flickering light fell on the figure of a boy who was sitting alone on a rock. So what did he see in the forest? He saw a figure of boy who was sitting. Where was the boy sitting? The boy was sitting on a rock. Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark. So what was the first thing that came in mind of Mr. Oliver when he saw? Mr. Oliver thought that the boy whom he saw was the boy from his school. And the boys, according to the rules and regulations that was followed in the school, they were not supposed to be out after the dark. So he thought that he is one of the boy from his school and he's sitting out in dark and he's not supposed to be there in the dark. So he asked the boy, "What are you doing out here, boy?" So he asked the boy, thinking that he was one of the students from his school. Asked Mr. Oliver sharply, moving closer so that he could recognize the miscreant. Miscreant means a person who has done some mischief. So he thought that he is a mischievous student from his school and he's broken the rules and regulations. He's not followed the rules and regulations of school. That is, he's out in dark from the school. And so he, in a very sharp tone, as if scolding the boy, in a very authoritative tone, he asked him that, "What are you doing here?" Thinking that he was a mischievous boy from his school. But even as he approached the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. But in a second, he thought that something was wrong with the boy. So what made him think that? The boy appeared to be crying, because he saw that the boy appeared to be crying. He saw that the boy was crying. His head hung down. He held his face in his hands. So his head was hung down and he was holding his face in his hands. And his body shook convulsively. Convulsively means moving suddenly. It was strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy. So, distinctly means clearly. So, it was clear from the expressions of Mr. Oliver that he was feeling uneasy. He was not comfortable on seeing the boy crying that way. So, even the way the boy was crying was very strange. So that is why the weeping, the crying of child is explained in these three words. It was strange, soundless weeping. That is the reason that he felt uneasy. And when did he feel that something was wrong with the boy? When he saw him crying with his head hung down and face in his hands. So his body was shaking continuously. And it was very strange, soundless weeping. So this is what we have read about the boy in this page. So what would happen next, we'll be reading on the next page. Yes. Well, what's the matter? So this is the next question that is being asked by Mr. Oliver to the boy. The first question was, what are you doing out here, boy? So he did not reply. The boy did not reply. Mr. Oliver went closer to him, but he found that something was wrong with him, because the way he was crying was very strange. His head was hung down, his face was in his hands, and his body was shaking. And it was very strange, soundless weeping, which made Mr. Oliver uneasy. Then he asked him, what's the matter? He asked his anger giving way to concern. So earlier he was angry on the boy, thinking him to be student who was out of the school in dark, and thinking him to be a mischievous student. He was very angry on him, the way he spoke to him. But later on, when he had seen that something was wrong with the boy, his anger changed to concern. Now he was more concerned that maybe something wrong has happened with the boy. What are you crying for? So he asked the boy that what was he crying for? The boy would not answer or look up. So the boy was sitting in the same posture. He did not look up, he did not answer. His body continued to be racked with the silent sobbing. So he was continuously, his body was shaking because of the silent weeping. Come on, boy, you shouldn't be out here at this hour. So he said, the boy, that why are you here at this hour? It was late night, and what was he doing there? Tell me the trouble, look up. So when he asked the boy to look up, the boy looked up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at the teacher. So he took off his hands. He was covering his face with his hands. He took off his hands and he looked up at the teacher. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could ever call it a face. So now the suspense is revealed. So what had happened? The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, and it was not worth calling a face, because it had no eyes, ears, nose or mouth. So it was just a flat surface with no eyes, ears or mouth. You can very well imagine how would your face look if there were no eyes, ears or mouth on it. So it was just like a round ball. It was just a round smooth head with a school cap on top of it. So if you're asked to explain how the face of the boy looked like, so it had no eyes, nose or mouth, and it was round smooth head with a school cap on top of it. And that's where the story should end. So this is what Ruskin Bond is saying the story should have ended here. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. But it did not end here for Mr. Oliver. So we'll be reading in the next paragraph that what happened after that. The torch fell from his trembling hand. He turned and scrambled down the path. Scrambled means move with urgency or in panic. So he scrambled down the path, running blindly through the forest and calling for help. So Mr. Oliver gets the shock of his life on seeing such a faceless boy in the middle of the forest. So it would anybody would behave that way. Anybody would react that way. So how did Mr. Oliver react on seeing the faceless boy? The torch fell from his trembling hand, one thing. He turned and scrambled down the path. He started running down the path through the trees and called for help. So torch fell from his trembling hand, one thing. He ran through the path blindly, second thing, and he called for help, that is third thing. So this is how Mr. Oliver reacted after seeing the face of the boy. He was still running towards the school building when he saw the lantern swinging in the middle of the path. So still Mr. Oliver was running towards the school building and he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. So a watchman was holding a lantern in his hand and it was swinging in the middle of the path. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman. So he did not stop running. So that is why he bumped into the watchman who was standing holding a lantern in his hand. Gasping for breath. Gasping means breathing with mouth open, especially because of surprise or shock. So he was breathing heavily when he bumped into a watchman. "What is it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. "Has there been an accident? Why are you running?" So the watchman continuously asked him three questions. He asked him, "What is it, Sahib?" He asked him if there had been an accident and why he was running. So to this, Mr. Oliver replied, "I saw something horrible. A boy weeping in the middle of the forest. He had no face." So he did not explain anything further. He did not tell what kind of face it was, or it was a featureless face. He just said that he saw something horrible and he saw a boy weeping in the forest and he had no face. So on hearing to this, the watchman, as if he's surprised, he said, "No face, Sahib? No eyes, nose, mouth, nothing?" See, he himself made it, answered it. He himself said that though Mr. Oliver never mentioned that the face did not have any eyes, mouth or nose. But this watchman said it himself. He said, "No eyes, nose, mouth, nothing." "Do you mean it was like this, Sahib?" asked the watchman and raised the lamp to his face, to his own face. So the watchman who raised the hand near his face, and he asked Mr. Oliver if the face of the boy was like the face of the watchman. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow. And that's when the wind blew the lamp out. So this is how the story ends. So the Mr. Oliver has seen that even the watchman had a featureless face, and the lamp blew out because of the wind. So the readers are left to imagine further. So what would have happened to Mr. Oliver, and who those people were with faceless features, with faceless face, featureless face. So it's all left to the imagination of readers, what would have happened next. So the ending of the story is very surprising.